Here we are again. We're doing the Kansas City Chiefs top 50 players of all time, and we are going to do numbers 35 through 31. And we're gonna start it off with number 35, Larry Johnson. Here's how we had him ranked: 26 for Matt Connor, 35 for Sterling, 35 for me, and 39 for Adam Best. Why don't we start with Adam on this one? Did you struggle putting Larry on the list? Great Chief, and we've been talking a lot about legacy and intangibles.
I really did struggle, and we're going to see that a lot during this discussion. We have a few guys that are remembered in a dark light, and a few guys that are kind of like heroes as men. It's hard to consider that. I mainly focused on the football here, and not the extracurricular or the off the field stuff, which is hard to do in some of these situations. He was a great player. But really, most of that was 2 seasons because he was stuck behind Priest. And I kind of wonder what happens with Larry Johnson if Herm Edwards, who I used to call Harm when this website first started, didn't harm Larry Johnson to such a degree. 416 carries, man. That is not right. Who comes back from that? Jamal Anderson had a season that he never came back from. I think this was the NFL record or close to it. He averaged 376 carries in 205, 206. And then he had about 3,500 yards. That is a great zenith of your career. But what do you think Christian Okoye or Marcus Allen or Jamal Charles does if they're running behind Willie Rofe, Will Shields, Brian Waters, that crew? I mean, Christian Okoye might still be running. Jamal Charles is averaging 8 yards per carry instead of the ludicrous number that he did. So we have to consider who's blocking for these guys as well. One of the most elite lines in NFL history. I don't think that's a stretch when you have 2 Hall of Famers on that line, and Brian Waters was unreal as well.
It was the most carries of all time in NFL history with 416. Second most, as you mentioned, Jamal Anderson with 410. You're right. Dude was absolutely electric, phenomenal player. What could have been with just relationship with the Chiefs off the field, all of that stuff, and also with not being stuck behind Priest Holmes. But to me, those 2 seasons catapulted him into 35 because they were just historic seasons. 1750 and 1789, those were back-to-back rush yards. But it wasn't just what he did on the ground. He was also a very capable pass catcher in those 2 years, 343 yards receiving and 410. That was fairly uncommon at that time to be not just a great runner, but also a great pass catcher. So for me, that had to add a little bit of value. Also coupling that with 37 touchdowns on the ground in those 2 years. I mean, it was just historic, that 2-year stretch. Again, you look at the tenure in Kansas City in totality, not quite as impressive, especially with the fall off. But when you are that phenomenal, that historic, even if it is only those 2 years, that is good enough for 35 in my book.
I had a real interesting relationship with Larry Johnson because when he was drafted, I didn't want him drafted. I was with Dick Vermeil. I don't want him drafted. What do we do in drafting a first round running back? When we already have what we do and with other needs. At the same time, Larry Johnson rushed for 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns in both college and at the pro level. Like, just putting achievements on paper. The guy rushed for 2,020, both at Penn State and then at the NFL level. And say what you want about overuse or the offensive line in front of him or whatever. But the list of people who've done those kinds of things, it's not long. In a way, I went from like, I don't really like this guy, or I'm not sure if he's good. And then I went to like, oh my gosh, I love this guy. And then after the suspension, the arguments, the injuries, the whatever, by the time he was suspended and then we release him before he could return to the field, I think, right? And the Bengals end up picking him up. I was so glad to see him with Cincinnati because I thought, yeah, he can be their headache, their problem, whatever. I actually ranked him the highest of any of us here, if I'm seeing that correctly. And there's a part of me that's going, what was I thinking? And then also I'm looking at the body of work and like what you said, that zenith of his career, and just thinking that's rare territory That's summiting a mountain that most people can't climb. And so I got to give credit there.
I just want to clear up one thing you said. He didn't rush for 2,000 yards on the ground in the NFL. He had 2,000 all-purpose yards.
Yeah, sorry, all-purpose yards.
No worries. He did 2,000 in college, back-to-back seasons of in 2005, 1750, 2006, 1789, and in both those seasons had 343 and 410 yards receiving, respectively. He was the Chiefs' offense during those 2 years.
Yeah.
I will also point out, for those that maybe don't remember, again, you do have to take everything in totality here. Some of the younger fans, he was 75 yards from passing Priest Holmes as the franchise's all-time leading rusher. Folks did not like Larry so much. Fans started a petition demanding the Chiefs either deactivate, release, or waive him.
Single season, right?
Yes. No, all time.
Oh, all time.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was the all-time record. He was 75 yards away. And then again, the day that he was due to return, the Chiefs waived him. And then reportedly, the final straw for GM Scott Pioli was another tweet going back to 2009. Twitter still getting athletes in trouble in 2009, apparently belittling a fan for making less money than he made.
Oh, that was just the tip of the iceberg. That was just the start. Yeah. And so that last season was 2009, where he was only with the Chiefs for 7 games. He only had 377 yards. His nickname that season, that's when I was running Arrowhead Addict, was 2.9, because that was his average yards per carry.
Oh, I remember
you remember that? And,
yes,
and
I do.
People despised Larry at that point, and we're like, hey, look, like, we don't want this guy. He was beloved, like any Chief that had as much success as he had. But then he had these off-field things where he was assaulting women, and it got worse for him after that. But he was arrested a bunch of times. He has a very unfortunate after football career as well. Some of those arrests came while he was still playing. And Chiefs fans, credit to Chiefs fans, you stop performing, you start acting like a scumbag off the field, and Chiefs fans are going to cut bait. And that's what they did with Larry, and credit to the Chiefs for moving on from him. I thought it was the right move at the time. That team wasn't going anywhere anyway. But when you look back at his football accomplishments, what he did in particular, those 2 seasons, was really, really incredible, pretty unheard of. And he deserves a spot. When you think of the great Chiefs running backs, you have to mention Larry Johnson. You just have to.
The problem is, it's that George Harrison thing again. Who is he sandwiched in between? Priest Holmes and Jamal Charles. Not only are they undoubtedly the 2 best rushers in franchise history, but they're 2 of the most beloved players in franchise history who still hold a special place in Chiefs fans' heart because of not only the way they played, but the way they carried themselves in the city.
And the Chiefs ran Larry Johnson into the ground. So he could have had maybe a different career if his load was managed a little bit differently, but that's what you got. You got 2 spectacular years when they couldn't do much of anything else except run Larry Johnson up the middle.
Exhibit A of why they have platoons now. I know all the fantasy players want, bell cows and these guys to be workhorses. Well, this is why you don't do that, because you give a guy 416 carries, he's never the same guy again. He ends up running for, like Patrick said, 3 yards in a cloud of dust.
Patrick mentioned 2.9, and I was like, man, I remember calling somebody that. I was back at Arrowhead Pride in those days, and I remember writing a story, and I was like, I know I called him it was 2.7 at the time, and I remember calling him 2.7, and I just looked up the story because I was like, I remember this being like really weird. He was 4th midway through the season, right? He's 4th in the NFL in carries after like the first 2 months. He's 4th in carries. He's averaging 2.7 yards per carry. And he's complaining that he's not getting enough opportunities from his head coach. All at the same time, this is happening. And fans were going, what the hell are you talking? I mean, it was so bananas. And like, that's when then he gets suspended, then it all like kind of falls apart. But that was how unlikable that's the shadow side of Larry Johnson's era.
Yes, and you were right. It was 2.7, not 2.9. He got a couple extra yards there at the end and raised his average. But It was hilarious because, of course, that was his number, was 27, and we were like, yeah, that's his average. And it was yes, it was very reminiscent of like that. And then like when they were giving Thomas Jones all those carries and not Jamal Charles, a very similar situation. All right, let's move on from Larry Johnson, an infamous place in Chiefs history, and go on to number 34 here, and that is Jim Tyrer. Jim Tyrer is an offensive tackle for the Chiefs, another Ohio guy from Newark, Ohio. Sort of met a tragic end here. We'll get to that, but let's talk a little bit about Jim's career, and let's start with Connor this time.
Jim Tyrer is really kind of a layered, interesting story here, because like earlier we were talking about how much Chiefs Kingdom loves good running backs, and going back through this timeline of like Okoye and all that stuff. The other thing that Chiefs fans really seem to love is like great offensive linemen. And we talk about like the glory days of Willie Roaf and Will Shields and some of these guys. But Jim Tyrer was really the first great tackle of the Chiefs. And, the guy was an Iron Man. He was a starter on the Super Bowl team. He played 180 straight games. So he was an Iron Man at the position, and he was just one of those early stars from the AFL into the NFL days. And so, really he was a star up front in that role, kind of maybe helped create some of the hunger in the franchise at that position. And then, of course, and we'll talk about the story here, but the story was later on, like into his postseason, and he couldn't. Maybe had some financial difficulties and ends up murdering his wife and then committing suicide. Sort of, it's crazy that one franchise has had multiple instances of that. But alas, here we are in that. But I remember looking up stuff about Jim Tyrer's story, and it's actually like that kind of case one for CTE, in that like there's a film done about him, and I read an interview with the filmmaker, and he said literally Jim Tyrer had the largest head in the National Football League in these days. And so to fit him with a helmet, they ripped out all the protective lining of his helmet. So he's playing with just like this thin shield, like while everyone else is playing with at least a standard helmet at the time. And then he plays 13 seasons that way. Unfortunately, he was cremated and no one could ever study his brain. I mean, the NFL feels light years behind this kind of thing. But yeah, here's a guy whose on-field legacy has certainly been tarnished by what happened, and it should be the case. And yet there's a story behind maybe why and how some of this stuff happened. Makes the whole thing very complicated. But for sure, on the field, he deserves to be here. He is one of those elite Iron Men, early heroes of the franchise. It's just really sad that this huge shadow this cloud looms over, and that maybe the football side was his own undoing.
Yeah, and I think Matt Connor, you did a phenomenal job just dissecting and going into everything right there. It's fascinating. Again, you're right, just overshadowed, and rightfully so. Again, we talked about Okoye for Chiefs running backs. He was a patient zero. We're talking about that with Jim Tyrer as far as Chiefs understanding of great offensive line play. Was him and Ed Buddy. Those were the two original starters, I think, for the Kansas City line. I mean, you look at a lot of older players, right? You talk to a lot of older players. They'll talk about Jim Tyrer and how dominating he was on the offensive line. I think you're right. I mean, it's such a complicated story that he has. We think Larry Johnson's story is complicated. We'll try this one, right? But the story of the helmet and just of everything in totality, it's wild to me. But you cannot deny the impact he had talent-wise, the impact he had from the AFL into the NFL, 8-time AFL All-Star before he even came to the NFL. I had him on my list at 31. I mean, he is just so phenomenally decorated. And again, I think we're talking about him in the same way, as far as he was the start of offensive line play that we consider historic and important right here in Kansas City.
Adam, anything to add on Jim here?
Yeah, quickly. He was very hard for me to rank because of the off the field stuff. And then you have a 6-time first team All-Pro. What do you do with that? But also kind of comparing him to the modern game, because he was a tackle that weighed 275, 280 pounds. And Willie Roaf weighs 320 pounds. Even someone like John Alt is over 300. So it's really hard. It's almost like comparing apples and oranges. But he definitely deserves a place on this list, personal issues notwithstanding.
Yeah, I kind of diverged from you guys on this one a little bit, at least in terms of the rankings. Connor had him at 40, Sterling at 31, Adam at 41. I had him at 21. I looked at this resume and I'm like, this guy was like Joe Thomas of his time, like just the absolute best. And so I thought about the off the field stuff and I considered his career. And I did make an assumption, not one that's backed by any actual facts, but the head injury stuff, you see some strange things happen with some of these ex-NFL players, and it does make you wonder. It changes some of these men. And back then, Matt mentioned that just zero protection that this person had. So I'd love to check out the documentary. I haven't seen it yet. Definitely check it out and find out more about a great Chiefs player who met an unfortunate and tragic end. All right, let's move on. 33, and that is the great Art Still, defensive end for the Chiefs, who to this day is up there with 42 and a half sacks, according to StatMuse, up there in the top 10 of Chiefs pass rushers all time. Who wants to kick us off with Art Still?
Dude was unreal. And by the way, he has some of the funniest stories you will ever hear a player ever have. I talked to him not that long ago, and he was like, some of his favorite memories were when they used to steal cookies from the practice facility, right? They'd just take all these cookies. Well, I guess apparently one time they wanted to catch who was doing it, and they put, I think, laxatives in the cookies. And they found out pretty quick who was taking the cookies. To this day, though, he was talking about how, no, man, that couldn't have been us, as they're sitting there on the porta potties. So Art Still, hilarious man, both on and off the field. Two-time second team All-Pro, 4-time Pro Bowler. Yeah, I mean, I think it's all self-explanatory of why he is this high on my list. He came in at 28. Again, if you're third all-time on the Chiefs sacks list, I think that gets you pretty up there. If you've not had a chance to listen to Art Still, try and find interviews of Art, because dude is incredibly entertaining. Love Art Still. Phenomenal off and on the field.
Tough to evaluate because compared to someone like Jim Lynch, this guy played in a barren wasteland, just the worst era of Chiefs football pretty much imaginable, and really stood out. Was a two-time All-Pro. Still, he was the number 2 overall pick. So did he necessarily live up to that billing? I'm not sure, but a great Chief, deserves to be on the list. Definitely.
I mean, I think if we would have grown up in the 80s, we'd be saying, be still my beating Art, right? I mean, the guy was a 2-time MVP of his own team. He was clearly just a clear leader on the roster in the clubhouse. And I just think this whole time period, we're just like, fast forward. And so, I mean, even right now, we're like, oh yeah, Art Still was good. He's on my list. And also not really sure how much to say about it, because we don't know what to say about the Chiefs in general during this whole time of mediocrity. It was just so bad. I almost feel bad for Art. It was like, it's too bad his parents couldn't have had sex later on or something, made him enjoy later years. So that's the way that works, guys. That's the way that works.
Well, it's hard to stand out when you're on a bad team. And a lot of us grew up watching really bad Chiefs teams, and we really clung to the players that were stars, because stars were so few and far between when the Chiefs were as bad as they were when Art was playing. And he still managed to get himself a second team All-Pro twice. In 1980 and 1984, a 4-time Pro Bowler, and was on the all-rookie team. And of course, he's in the Chiefs Hall of Fame. Shout out to Art, man, because it is hard to stand out in Kansas City in the 80s on the football team when not very many primetime games, all that kind of stuff. He did it. So congratulations to him. He makes it a really nice spot on the list. All right, moving on to number 32. This is an interesting one because he wasn't on the Chiefs for a long, long time, but it's another pass rusher. It's Justin Houston coming in at number 32. For me, he's in the Jared Allen, territory of great Chiefs pass rusher who wasn't here for that long. Who wants to kick us off talking about Justin Houston?
I love Justin Houston. I had him at number 36. I think that's probably like kind of around the middle of where I know I wasn't the one who had him the lowest. I also didn't have him the highest. But I mean, I love Justin Houston. I never wanted him to leave in the first place. I don't have any problem with the contract he signed. I know that for some people, Justin Houston represents sort of this black eye on the resume of John Dorsey. Oh, you shouldn't have, I mean, look, the guy had a 22 sack season. What are you going to do? Not pay him? You got to pay your pass rushers, and he was at a premium. And then you can't predict injuries. There's no way around it. So, I mean, I'm kind of getting in the weeds here about contracts and whatever, but that's a big talking point around Justin Houston is this sort of, he got the big contract and then fell off. It's like, well, he had an injury and then fell off. The guy became one of the NFL's most premier pass rushers. And by the way, he has still kicked ass for years after leaving the Chiefs. I mean, it's not like he's been that steady Carlos Dunlap type of pass rusher of getting 7, 8, 9, 10, sacks a year, 11 sacks a year, for the Colts and then the Ravens. Look, I thought he was a troubled kid out of Georgia. I remember when Scott Pioli took him in the third round, it felt like a risk worth taking. Then he comes in, becomes a tremendous pass rusher. He was truly feared by opposing offensive coordinators. He's definitely a guy they had to scheme around. He was the Chris Jones before Chris Jones arrived in this engine that the Chiefs had on defense, along with some other very good parts. I always liked Justin Houston. I always thought he was given a raw deal when people detracted from him, from his value because of like the size of the contract. It's like the size of his contract gave a shadow, just like a first round pick makes a shadow over Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And then the injuries hurt him from living up to that shadow. And then he kind of took on this bust label, and I just never understood why, or I thought that was unfairly applied. So I love him. He's been one of the best pass rushers of his generation, and I wish he was remembered as such. And I also wish that the bridges weren't burned there for Kansas City, because a homecoming would be really nice.
78.5 sacks in his Chiefs career, right? Just in his Chiefs career. He played 8 seasons here in Kansas City. He's 4th all time for sacks in a Chiefs uniform. And you're right, with the 22 sacks, what were the Chiefs supposed to do? If they didn't sign him, then you're screaming saying, how do you not bring back a guy who just had 22 sacks? I mean, Justin Houston was historically good for a stretch. And then again, injuries were a part of it. Without the Larry Johnson off the field and just contentment as well. Obviously, there was a little bit there with Justin Houston towards the end, but he really had that peak that was nearly unmatched in Kansas City. But he was consistent. 10 sacks, 11 sacks, 22 sacks, then in 11 games, 7.5 sacks, and the injury happened with only 5 games, then 9.5 and 15, then 9 and 12 games. Yeah, injuries happened, but when he was on the field, he was still putting up some pretty crazy numbers. Even in the season when he played 5 games, he had 4 sacks. Like, he was still a force to be reckoned with. I'm with you, Connor. I hate that we remember him based on the contract a lot of the times instead of what he actually was as a player. I had him on my list coming in at 32.
Yeah, you mentioned 4th all time on the Chiefs. He's got more sacks than Chris Jones does with the Chiefs. Not for long, but he does. He could have been able to not been injured. I mean, he would be maybe 2nd. He could have gotten to 2nd all time for the Chiefs in sacks. I think he has all time 112 sacks all time in his career. So if he was with the Chiefs with those numbers, he would be behind only Derek Thomas. An incredible player. Adam?
Feels like he's going to play another 5 years. Like, this guy's never going to stop playing. And he's got that like old man strength at this point. He is definitely very high on the power rankings of Chiefs players I'd least like to fight. I mean, he's just a scary, scary man. Just a freak of nature, too. At 270, runs a 4.6 40, or at least did out of college. His 10-yard dash was 1.6. That's like a receiver number right there. So kind of just a freakish dude who put up some great seasons here. And it's curious how certain players fall out of favor, are very popular and then aren't popular and then aren't again. I mean, look at the career arc of Frank Clark in Kansas City. He was villain and then he left and people love him now. And it makes your head spin sometimes, but he definitely deserves a place on this list. And Patrick, I think that was a good comp with Jared Allen. He just didn't quite play enough of his career here for him to be like a top 25 guy, top 20 guy, but he's had a hell of a career, and we'll see how long it can keep going.
Can we just talk real fast, though? He's one sack away from being in the top 25 in NFL history. Like, of all the pass rushers that we talk about, he's one sack away from being in like this rarefied air, right? This elite company that's almost all Hall of Famers. It's the top 25 here, and then he's going to climb from there. So you have to assume he's going to end up somewhere within that. What other team is going to claim him? He played the longest for the Chiefs, and yet our references to him are, well, he didn't play long enough for the Chiefs. You have one of the top pass rushers historically, all time in the NFL, with no team that really claims him.
Because he's worn 5 uniforms.
We claim him. How do you not claim? If you're a Chiefs fan and don't claim Justin Houston, that's on you, dog.
I guess I'm just saying, what other player in remotely close to that part of NFL history on the stat sheet has this sort of weird quandary of
Frank Gore?
Maybe, right?
Tony Gonzalez. A lot of Chiefs fans are still pissed off, and they're like, no, he's a Falcon now.
Those are silly, and of course,
that's the worst, the absolute worst.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me that like there's not a ton of Justin Houston jerseys still being sold for nostalgia's sake. And honestly, I feel the same way about Eric Berry, by the way. I've got some real qualms with the way we remember Eric Berry. But that said, I just wanted to add historical notes here about Justin Houston. The all-time numbers are all-time good.
Yeah, and I don't know. It could be the end for him. Look, after he leaves Kansas City, he goes on to play 2 years in Indianapolis, racking up 11 and 8 sacks in those 2 years. Then he goes to Baltimore, 4.5, 9.5, moves on again. And he's in Carolina last year, starts 7 games for them, half a sack. So is he injured? Is he toast? Is he just on the Panthers? There's a lot of explanations, but he is, 35 now? 35. So does he have one more year in him? Do the Chiefs need a rotational pass rusher next year? If he has anything left, I'd love to see him back in Kansas City, as you mentioned, Matt, to finish his career, to come in and be that pass rush specialist. But it is kind of rough and frustrating that he kind of got off the bus right before the bus got to where it was heading with the Kansas City Chiefs. He, plays through 2018, and then here come all the Super Bowls and all the championships. And if you look back at what he contributed to this team, it would be nice if Justin Houston had a ring in Kansas City. Maybe he can come back and get one this year. But after half a sack last year, he may not. His phone may not ring.
He's kind of the defensive Alex Smith in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a good comp. That's a really good comp. Okay, let's move on to one of my favorite Chiefs of all time that I've never seen play. Number 31, Joe Delaney, a really interesting one, not ranked by Adam Best. And I think I can understand why. 29 for Matt Connor, 33 for Sterling, and 28 for me.
Why so high, Patrick?
When I think about being a Chiefs fan, covering the Chiefs as I did here at Arrowhead Addict for a number of years on the website editorially, the day every year that was the anniversary of Joe Delaney's death, we would do a post, and probably still do a post marking that day and recognizing that day. I was always shocked at how much it touched me each year to revisit Joe Delaney's story. And if you don't know the story, Joe Delaney tragically drowned trying to save some children who were in trouble in a swimming hole after just 2 years on the Chiefs. Joe did not know how to swim and still ran into this swimming hole that was incredibly deep. It wasn't really a swimming hole. It was like a construction hole that had filled up with water that hot people were using to try to cool off. And in the Sports Illustrated article, if you read it, it's still there on the website. He stops and says to a kid, I'm paraphrasing here, but I don't know how to swim well, but I got to help save those kids. If I don't come up, get help. And this young man who, at the time is a 2-year running back, dies at the age of 24, knowing he doesn't, must have been terrifying. I don't know if any of you have ever been in trouble for a second in the water, but it's a very scary experience. And to know that you don't know how to swim, but to go and to try to do the right thing anyway. And one of those kids survived. And I think it was two others or one other that passed away, unfortunately, along with Joe. When I think about what it means to be a Kansas City Chiefs fan, and I think about the history of the franchise, I feel incredibly honored to be associated in any way with Joe Delaney. And so for me, and he was a great player. He was made the Pro Bowl, was a Rookie of the Year. He's in the Chiefs Hall of Fame. That's why I had him so high. Joe Delaney deserves to be, very high up on this list because he is what being a Chief, in my view, is all about.
Yeah, he exemplifies all those things, exemplifies all that is good with Kansas City and with being a Chief. And you completely, that was perfect, Patrick. I mean, that was very well said. Because again, you don't have a lot to go off of on the field, but what he did on the field was also phenomenal, right? 1,121 yards in his one full season. All-Pro Offensive Rookie of the Year, third overall. Oilers defensive end, and then Pro Football Hall of Famer eventually. Evan Bethea was quoted in saying, "I've played against the best. O.J. Simpson, Gale Sayers, Walter Payton, and Joe ranks right up there with him. He is great with a capital G. He gave up his life to save some drowning kids, and in return, we'll never know his impact, his totality, legacy-wise on the field, but what he did off the field was even more impactful." Yeah, Patrick, I mean, you said that so perfectly, man.
The idea of, I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway for something greater than me, is the height of humanity's potential, right? For any of us at any time, it is the greatest thing that we can offer is to see what someone else needs and then attempt to provide that even with our own limitations. And so, in a way, what I love here about the Chiefs, and it reflects positively on the organization, the Chiefs have done a phenomenal job of remembering Joe Delaney's legacy. Like every single year, the story's told. Every single year, we're all reminded. I feel like fans who are not even within a generation of Joe can still know the story. And I feel like they will continue to tell the story even after we're all gone. And so, in that way, that also makes me proud of the Chiefs because they didn't just it wasn't just some pomp and circumstance in the moment, retire the number and then let it go. It feels like they really endeavor to keep his legacy, his story, his example alive and well.
I think Ronald Reagan said it perfectly. He was given posthumously the Presidential Citizens Medal, and then it was eventually presented to Delaney's family by Vice President at the time, George H.W. Bush. But Reagan's words were, he made the ultimate sacrifice by placing the lives of 3 children above regard for his own safety. By the supreme example of courage and compassion, this brilliantly gifted young man left a spiritual legacy for his fellow Americans.
It feels silly to talk about rankings when we're dealing with such a hero, but that's what we're doing here. And we kind of each defined the parameters of our own list. For me, I already had a lot of running backs on there, and I just didn't feel like he accomplished enough on the field. That was kind of my focus here. That's why some other people who are the opposite of him in terms of a role model are still on the list, and he wasn't. Very hard to exclude him, but you've got 5 running backs ahead of him. How many running backs can you put on this list? It's kind of like Connor said about how many kickers can you put on the list. At some point, you have to kind of count that up and make some tough calls.
I just want to take a moment because I did my best to sort of explain what happened. And the Sports Illustrated article was really fantastic. It's called "Sometimes the Good Die Young." You should go and read it if you're not familiar with Joe's story, or just if you've never read this particular article. And I just want to read the section that I mentioned that has such a profound impact on me. There was a huge hole there carved out of earth some time ago. The hole had filled with water and 3 boys waded in. They didn't know it, but a short way out to the bottom dropped off precipitously, and suddenly the boys were in over their heads and thrashing and screaming. There were all sorts of people around, but only Joe dashed to the pond. There was a little boy there. "Can you swim?" he asked Joe. "I can't swim good," Joe said, "but I've got to save those kids. If I don't come up, get somebody." And he rushed into the water. One boy fought his way back to the shallow part. The other 2 didn't. Neither did Joe Delaney, 24. He was hauled out a few minutes later, dead. He gave his own life trying to save 3 others. God rest his soul. That's all that I can say about Joe. I teared up reading it. I tear up every time I read it. It's a fantastic piece of writing. You should be proud that Joe Delaney was a Kansas City Chief, and a brilliant life and a brilliant career cut short. And as Sterling mentioned, was awarded the Citizens Medal from the president. Over 3,000 people attended his funeral. Just an absolutely incredible human being, and a fitting end, I think, to this section of the 50 greatest Chiefs. We appreciate all of you for joining us. For Adam Best, Matt Connor, Sterling Holmes, my name is Patrick Allen. We'll catch you next time.